Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we'll step into a world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where the scent of roses mingles with the faint aroma of lavender and the chilling breath of deceit. It's a place where appearances deceive and truth hides behind lace curtains, patiently awaiting the keen eye that can pierce through the polite veneer of village life. Our journey will take us to a time when telegrams were swift and gossip even swifter, a time when a well-bred lady's disappearance could unravel an entire community. Prepare yourselves for a tale of human nature, flawed and fascinating, as seen through the discerning gaze of our quiet observer. Now let us begin with Chapter 1 of The Disappearance of Lady Rowena. Chapter 1. The First Whisper. The village of St. Mary Mead, like many of its kind at the dawn of the 20th century, hummed with a rhythm as predictable as the church clock. Elms lined the lanes, cottages huddled together under thatched roofs, and life revolved around the seasons, Sunday service, and the occasional well-meaning committee meeting. It was a place where nothing truly remarkable ever happened, or so it seemed to the casual observer. Yet, beneath the tranquil surface, the currents of human passion and petty grievance flowed as surely as the little river that snaked through Farmer Giles's pasture. Miss Jane Marple, a lady whose soft, woolly shawls and gentle countenance belied a mind as sharp as a newly honed needle, often found these currents more compelling than any grand adventure. From her drawing-room window at Danemead, she watched the world go by, gathering observations that, when polished by her unique intellect, often proved startlingly illuminating. She knew her village, and by extension, she knew mankind. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early May when the first hint of disruption stirred the placid waters of St. Mary Mead. The air was soft, sweet with lilac, and Miss Marple was meticulously pruning her rose bushes when she saw Mrs. Gable, the bustling housekeeper from Blackwood Manor, hurrying past with an unusual intensity in her step. Mrs. Gable, a woman usually given to cheerful greetings and a leisurely pace when off duty, barely offered a distracted nod. Her face was a study in agitation, her normally rosy cheeks quite pale. Miss Marple paused, her secateurs still. Mrs. Gable lived at Blackwood Manor, the grandest house in the vicinity, home to Sir Geoffrey and Lady Rowena Ashworth. Lady Rowena, a woman of considerable beauty in her youth, had a reputation for being rather particular. She was known for her exquisite gowns, her demanding nature, and her habit of sending Mrs. Gable on errands for the most obscure items. But this hurried, almost frantic demeanor was entirely out of character for the usually unflappable housekeeper. Later that evening the whispers began. Old Miss Weatherby, whose hearing was as keen as her eyesight was failing, stopped by the post office and heard Mrs. Lumley, the postmistress, murmuring to Mr. Pritchard, the baker. "Not been seen all day," Mrs. Lumley was saying, her voice lowered conspiratorially, "and Sir Geoffrey quite beside himself, or so Mrs. Gable says." The subject of their hushed conversation was, of course, Lady Rowena Ashworth. She had failed to appear for her morning tea, an unprecedented event given her strict schedule, and her maid had found her bed undisturbed, yet her dressing-gown and slippers were gone. A minor oddity, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead an oddity was rarely minor. Miss Marple, upon hearing this from her gardener, young Jim, merely nodded, but a tiny flicker of interest ignited in her clear blue eyes. The rose bushes, she mused, sometimes hid the most unexpected things. Chapter 2. An Unsettling Calm. The next morning the village stirred with an unusual tension. The early mist clung heavier than usual, and a hushed quiet seemed to descend over St. Mary Mead, broken only by the caw of rooks from the ancient elms. Lady Rowena Ashworth was still missing. Sir Geoffrey had confirmed it to Inspector Davis, who had arrived from the nearest market-town Market Basing that very morning. The news traveled faster than any official communiqué, carried on the invisible currents of gossip that permeated every cottage and shop. Miss Marple received a detailed account from Cherry, her young maid, who had overheard the postman discussing it with Mrs. Hemingway, wife of Blackwood Manor's estate manager. According to Cherry, Sir Geoffrey Ashworth was calm but deeply distressed. Miss Marple, however, found this particular phrasing rather intriguing. Distress, yes, was to be expected, but calm? For a husband whose wife had vanished without a trace from their secure manor, it struck Miss Marple as an unusual adjective. One might expect frantic worry, perhaps even a touch of panic. Inspector Davis, a solid, methodical man with a handlebar mustache, began his preliminary investigations at Blackwood Manor. He interviewed Sir Geoffrey, a man of distinguished bearing and silvering temples, who reiterated that Lady Rowena had simply not been in her bed when her maid, Elsie, came to wake her. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing amiss in the house save for Lady Rowena's absence. A note of regret laced Sir Geoffrey's voice as he spoke of his wife's delicate constitution, and a vague hint that she had been under some strain recently. The police scoured the grounds. The manicured lawns, the rose garden, the walled kitchen garden, the small coppice bordering the property, all yielded nothing. It was as if Lady Rowena had simply dematerialized into the thin morning air. Her favorite cashmere shawl was still draped over a chair in the drawing-room. Her half-read novel lay open on her bedside table, and her pearl necklace, which she rarely removed, remained in its velvet box. It seemed a spontaneous vanishing, yet the lack of a personal note, a change of clothes, or even a carriage waiting, spoke of something else entirely. Miss Marple, hearing these details, pictured the manor house in her mind's eye. A house, like a person, had its habits. Lady Rowena was a creature of routine. To deviate so dramatically without leaving a single trace was highly improbable. It was the lack of anything, struggle, a message, a reason, that made the whole affair profoundly unsettling. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a discreet visit to Mrs. Gable, ostensibly to inquire about a recipe, but with a sharper purpose in mind. As she walked, she noticed a single, rather expensive-looking brooch lying half-buried in the soil by the roadside, a good distance from the manor gates. It certainly wasn't Lady Rowena's style, yet it was undeniably out of place. Chapter 3. The Search Begins. The arrival of Inspector Craddock, a keen-eyed detective from Scotland Yard, escalated the investigation from a local curiosity to a full-blown mystery. Craddock, a younger, sharper version of Inspector Davis, exuded an air of quiet competence. He immediately initiated a more thorough search of Blackwood Manor and its extensive grounds, bringing in a small team of uniformed constables who combed every inch of the estate. The village watched, fascinated and apprehensive, as the quiet lanes filled with official vehicles. Miss Marple, from her vantage point, noted Craddock's methodical approach. He wasn't just looking for Lady Rowena. He was looking for discrepancies. He spoke to everyone: Elsie the maid, Mrs. Gable the housekeeper, Mr. Hemingway the estate manager, and even young Penelope Ashworth, Lady Rowena's niece, who lived with the couple. Penelope, a quiet girl of about 20, appeared pale and withdrawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sorrow. The initial interviews revealed little new information. Sir Geoffrey maintained his composed distress, emphasizing his confusion and his wife's delicate health. "She has been under a certain melancholy of late," he offered to Craddock, his gaze distant. Mrs. Gable reiterated that everything seemed normal the evening before Lady Rowena vanished. Elsie, the maid, confirmed that the bed had not been slept in, but she had noticed a small, almost imperceptible smudge of mud on the pristine Persian rug near the bedside, something she dismissed as a garden shoe mark from earlier in the day. It was during the systematic search of the manor that a small but intriguing detail emerged. In Lady Rowena's dressing-room, a single exquisite silk slipper was found tucked beneath a chaise lounge, while its mate was still neatly placed beside her bed. It was a trifling detail, easily overlooked, but it snagged Miss Marple's attention when she heard of it from Cherry, whose cousin was one of the constables. Why would a woman leave in such haste that she would lose a shoe, yet still manage to dress herself sufficiently, given that her dressing-gown and slippers were gone from the bedside? And if she left so quickly, why had no one heard her? The slippers seemed to suggest a hurried departure, perhaps even a struggle, yet the rest of the house offered no such clues. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, no signs of an intruder. Craddock, though puzzled by the slipper, focused on the broader picture, suspecting an elopement, or more grimly, an accident on the sprawling estate. But Miss Marple considered the slipper. It was too neat, almost too poignant. It felt less like a genuine clue and more like a carefully placed punctuation mark in a story that hadn't yet been fully told. Chapter 4. A Ripple of Secrets. The small slipper, carefully examined and photographed by the police, remained an enigma. Its pristine condition, save for a faint scuff on the sole, only deepened the mystery. Inspector Craddock, though outwardly confident, confessed privately to Inspector Davis that the case was proving stubbornly unyielding. The lack of any concrete evidence, coupled with the Ashworths' seemingly respectable and unremarkable life, made it difficult to find a starting point. Miss Marple meanwhile began her own quieter inquiries. She made a point of visiting Mrs. Gable again, this time with a basket of fresh eggs from her hens. Over tea and shortbread, the housekeeper, initially hesitant, began to loosen her tongue. Lady Rowena was always a difficult mistress, bless her soul, Mrs. Gable sighed, stirring her tea. Vain about her appearance, terribly so, and prone to fits sometimes, especially if things didn't go her way. She then spoke of Lady Rowena's recent preoccupation with a specific portrait, an ancestral painting of a stern-looking matriarch that hung in the main hall. Lady Rowena had apparently spent hours studying it, almost obsessively, in the days leading up to her disappearance. This detail, though seemingly innocuous, resonated with Miss Marple. She recalled Mrs. Gable's earlier mention of Lady Rowena's temper. Perhaps there were deeper currents in the manner than simple marital bliss. She also observed Penelope Ashworth, the niece, whose silent presence at the manor was a topic of hushed speculation. Penelope seemed to shrink from attention, her eyes darting nervously when asked about her aunt. Was it grief or something else? Miss Marple remembered an old village tale about a young woman trapped in a loveless situation, a story that now seemed to whisper through the hallowed halls of Blackwood. During his interviews, Craddock also noted Sir Geoffrey's curious evasiveness concerning the family finances. He dismissed the questions as impertinent, but his hand trembled slightly as he poured himself another brandy. Mr. Hemingway. The estate manager was similarly vague, suggesting that the manor's upkeep was a constant drain, but quickly backtracking when pressed. The grand façade of Blackwood Manor, it seemed, might be concealing more than just a missing lady. The village, always quick to observe, had noted that Sir Geoffrey had recently mortgaged some outlying fields, a fact that had surprised many. Miss Marple, connecting the portrait, the temperament, and the finances, began to suspect that Lady Rowena's vanity might have been tied to something far more substantial than her appearance. Chapter 5. The Letter. Just as the police were beginning to consider the bleak possibilities of foul play, a new development emerged that seemed to offer a simpler, if no less painful, explanation. A letter, postmarked from London, arrived at Blackwood Manor, addressed to Sir Geoffrey. It was from Lady Rowena. The letter, penned in Lady Rowena's distinctive, elegant hand, stated that she had left of her own free will. She spoke of a sudden, overwhelming need for a change, a desire to escape the suffocating routine of village life and to rediscover herself. She assured Sir Geoffrey that she was well, and asked him not to worry, promising to contact him again when she was ready. The tone was distant, almost cold, offering little in the way of explanation or comfort. Sir Geoffrey, upon receiving the letter, expressed a mixture of relief and deep hurt. "I always knew Rowena had a restless spirit," he told Inspector Craddock, his voice heavy with resignation. "But I never imagined she would simply abandon everything." The letter, found among the day's regular post, seemed to confirm his earlier hint about his wife's melancholy. Inspector Craddock, though still harboring a flicker of doubt, conceded that the evidence now strongly pointed to a voluntary departure. The case, it appeared, was resolving itself into a domestic affair rather than a criminal one. The village, of course, buzzed with this new information. Lady Rowena, a woman of means, had simply run off. It was scandalous, certainly, but less alarming than murder. Miss Marple, however, found herself peculiarly unconvinced. She listened to the details related by Cherry, who had heard it from Mrs. Gable, who in turn had heard it from Sir Geoffrey himself. The elegance of the handwriting, the carefully chosen words, they felt a little too perfect. Lady Rowena was known for her dramatic flair, but also for her exacting nature. Miss Marple recalled an incident years ago involving a young woman in the village who had forged a letter from her runaway brother to spare her aging mother distress. The subtle nuances, the way certain phrases were turned, even the choice of paper, these things could be telling. She also remembered Lady Rowena's habit of using a very particular brand of stationery, one with a distinct watermark. The police, understandably, had not considered this. Miss Marple, however, harbored a quiet suspicion that the letter, despite its apparent authenticity, was designed to mislead. Chapter 6. A Shadow of the Past. The letter from Lady Rowena had largely satisfied the official police inquiry. Inspector Craddock, while still maintaining an open file, had scaled back the investigation considerably, leaving only Inspector Davis to handle the residual inquiries. The general consensus in St. Mary Mead was that Lady Rowena, flighty and self-absorbed as she was, had simply sought a new adventure, perhaps with a secret admirer. Miss Marple, however, refused to let the matter rest. The perfectly worded letter, the unexpected spontaneity from a woman of rigid routine, and the nagging detail of the missing slipper continued to trouble her. She decided to delve into Lady Rowena's past, a past that seemed as unblemished as her family crest. With a polite excuse, she called upon old Miss Weatherby, whose memory, though selective, often yielded forgotten gems. Miss Weatherby, after a lengthy discussion about the proper way to make gooseberry jam, suddenly recalled a snippet of gossip from years ago. Before she married Sir Geoffrey, dear Rowena was quite smitten with a young artist, Miss Weatherby announced, her eyes twinkling with remembered scandal. A bohemian sort, no money, but quite dashing. Her family, of course, put a stop to it. He vanished, poor boy. Went to America, I believe. She couldn't remember his name, only that he painted gloomy pictures. This new piece of information, though old, piqued Miss Marple's interest. A suppressed passion, an unfulfilled longing, these could be powerful motivators. She also recollected Mrs. Gable's comment about Lady Rowena's recent obsession with the ancestral portrait. Could there be a connection? Later that day, while walking by Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple observed Mr. Hemingway, the estate manager, having a hushed conversation with a shabbily dressed man she didn't recognize. The man had a distinctive, rather old-fashioned bowler hat. Their discussion seemed animated, and as the stranger walked away, he glanced nervously towards the manor. Mr. Hemingway, upon seeing Miss Marple, quickly busied himself with a border of pansies, his face flushed. The unexpected visitor and Hemingway's unusual reaction seemed a far cry from the narrative of a restless Lady Rowena. Miss Marple felt a prickle of intuition. The past, she knew, rarely stayed buried for long, and it often brought with it unexpected company. Chapter 7. A Change in Routine. The mysterious visitor to Blackwood Manor and Mr. Hemingway's subsequent unease only strengthened Miss Marple's conviction that Lady Rowena's disappearance was far from a simple elopement. She began to focus on the seemingly insignificant details of Lady Rowena's recent activities, knowing that a deviation from routine often heralded something larger. Through discreet conversations with tradespeople and their wives, Miss Marple learned that Lady Rowena had, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, made several unusual requests. The village dressmaker, Mrs. Bantry, recalled Lady Rowena ordering a particularly plain traveling cloak, entirely unsuited to her usual flamboyant taste. Not a stitch of lace or trim, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry had marveled, and in a rather drab gray, too. Said she needed it for discreet travel, if you please. Even more puzzling was a request made to Mr. Higginbottom, the village chemist. Lady Rowena, known for her selection of expensive French perfumes, had purchased a small vial of a common, almost medicinal scent, lavender water. She had also asked for a specific, rather obscure brand of tranquilizer. Mr. Higginbottom had thought nothing of it at the time, attributing it to her nerves, but now, in hindsight, he found it peculiar. These details painted a picture of someone preparing for a journey, yes, but not a romantic assignation or an impulsive escape. The plain cloak, the common scent, the tranquilizer, they suggested a desire for anonymity, for quietude, perhaps even a need to calm agitated nerves. It was a woman preparing not for adventure, but for concealment. Miss Marple then recalled another detail from Mrs. Gable. Lady Rowena had been unusually attentive to the Manor's old carriage, rarely used, asking Mr. Hemingway about its state of repair. Hemingway had assured her it was fine, though it hadn't been out of the coach-house in months. A carriage, a plain cloak, tranquilizers, a drab scent? These were not the accoutrements of an eloping grand lady. They were the tools of someone seeking to vanish without a trace, and to do so in a way that would not draw attention. This was not a flight of fancy, Miss Marple realized, but a carefully planned and executed scheme. The question remained, whose scheme was it, and for what purpose? Chapter 8. The Financial Angle. The pieces of Miss Marple's quiet investigation began to align with a chilling clarity. The plain cloak, the lavender water, the tranquilizer, and the inquiry about the old carriage all suggested a meticulously planned disappearance, not a spontaneous flight. But if Lady Rowena had engineered her own vanishing, why? And if she hadn't, who had gone to such lengths to make it appear so? Miss Marple turned her attention back to the matter of finances, in an area where human motives often lay bare. She discreetly inquired about Sir Geoffrey Ashworth's financial standing, a delicate subject in St. Mary Mead. It was known that the Ashworth estate, Blackwood Manor, was old and grand, but such grandeur often came with a hefty price tag. Through conversations with the local bank manager, Mr. Ainsworth, a frequent caller at Miss Marple's garden parties, it came to light that Sir Geoffrey had recently taken out a substantial loan against the estate. "Old Blackwood is a bottomless pit, I'm afraid," Mr. Ainsworth had confided, shaking his head. "Sir Geoffrey has been struggling for years to keep up appearances, and Lady Rowena, bless her, was accustomed to a rather extravagant lifestyle." The most significant detail, however, was that Lady Rowena herself possessed a considerable private fortune, inherited from her mother, which was entirely separate from Sir Geoffrey's estate, and controlled solely by her. Had she been toying with her husband's desperation? This private fortune, and its independent control, cast a new light on the disappearance. If Lady Rowena had truly fled, she would have taken her fortune with her. If she had been permanently removed, then her fortune would eventually revert to Sir Geoffrey as her sole heir. This was a powerful motive, one that made the voluntary departure letter seem far too convenient. Then there was the matter of Mr. Hemingway, the estate manager, and the shabbily dressed man. Miss Marple learned that the man was a bookmaker from London, known for his association with gambling debts. Hemingway, she discovered, had a secret passion for the horses, a passion that often outstripped his means. His position at Blackwood Manor, overseeing finances and estate matters, placed him in a uniquely compromising position. Could Hemingway be involved, perhaps coerced or bribed? The financial desperation of Sir Geoffrey, coupled with Hemingway's secret debts, created a potent brew of potential motives and complicity. The serene facade of Blackwood Manor was crumbling, revealing layers of quiet desperation and hidden greed. Chapter 9. The Hidden Room Object. The financial entanglement and the subtle, persistent clues were now firmly pointing away from a simple elopement. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in the grand gestures, but in the overlooked details. She recalled Lady Rowena's recent preoccupation with the ancestral portrait in the main hall, a stern, imposing painting of a long-dead matriarch. With a well-placed suggestion to Inspector Craddock, who was quietly reviewing the case after Miss Marple's indirect prompting about the letter, a more thorough examination of the manor's architecture was undertaken. Craddock, initially skeptical, humored the elderly lady, recalling her past successes. He focused on the portrait mentioned, noting its peculiar position. It hung on a section of wall that seemed thicker than the rest, next to a forgotten, seldom-used alcove. Under Craddock's closer inspection, A tiny, almost invisible seam was discovered in the elaborate wooden paneling behind the portrait. With a gentle push and a faint click, a narrow, cleverly disguised door swung inward, revealing a small, dusty priest hole, a relic from centuries past. Inside it was dark and cramped, but not entirely empty. There was a faint scent of old lavender, the very scent Lady Rowena had purchased, and a small antique wooden box. The box contained several items: a significant sum of money in old, high-denomination banknotes, a small, worn, leather-bound diary, and a will. The will was dated only weeks before Lady Rowena's disappearance, and its contents were startling. It bequeathed her considerable private fortune, not to Sir Geoffrey, but to her niece, Penelope, with a small annuity for Mrs. Gable, and nothing for her husband. The diary, written in Lady Rowena's hand, spoke of her growing fear for her safety, her suspicions about Sir Geoffrey's financial dealings, and her belief that he was attempting to slowly poison her. She recounted vague, unsettling episodes of confusion and weakness after meals, which she attributed to the tranquilizer she suspected he was administering. The priest hole and its contents drastically altered the nature of the investigation. Lady Rowena had not fled. She had been preparing to defend herself or to escape a very real and present danger from within her own home. The calm distress of Sir Geoffrey, the voluntary departure letter, the lost slipper, all now seemed carefully staged elements of a much darker plot. The ancestral portrait, Miss Marple realized, had been her quiet confidant, guarding a terrible secret. Chapter 10. The Alibi Crumbles. The discovery of the priest hole, Lady Rowena's new will, and the chilling entries in her diary sent shockwaves through the quiet investigation. Inspector Craddock now had a clear direction, and the case shifted from a missing person inquiry to a probable murder investigation. Sir Geoffrey Ashworth immediately became the primary suspect, his earlier composure now appearing disturbingly cold and calculating. The diary detailed Lady Rowena's growing suspicion that she was being slowly poisoned with sedatives, leading to the confusion and weakness she attributed to melancholy. This explained her purchase of the tranquilizer, not for her own escape, but perhaps to discreetly confirm the substance or to provide an alibi for her unusual sleepiness. It also explained her interest in the old carriage and the plain traveling cloak. She was not preparing to elope, but to flee a life-threatening situation. The brooch found on the road, likely a plan of distraction, too far from the manor to be hers. Craddock, with renewed vigor, revisited Sir Geoffrey's alibi. Sir Geoffrey maintained that he had been in his study all evening, working on estate papers, and had gone to bed around midnight, only to discover his wife missing the next morning. However, Miss Marple recalled a seemingly trivial detail from the night of the disappearance: a sudden, brief downpour, accompanied by an unusually loud crack of thunder, had occurred just after 10 o'clock. This was a detail she had discussed with Cherry, who had remembered a small leak in the pantry roof that needed attending to after the storm. When Craddock pressed Sir Geoffrey about the exact timing of his activities, mentioning the storm, the distinguished gentleman became flustered. He vaguely recalled the rain, but insisted he was deep in thought and had not noticed the time. Miss Marple knew from her observations of her own village that very few people could ignore that particular storm. It had rattled every window-pane. Miss Marple then observed Penelope Ashworth, who remained unusually quiet, almost shrinking from the gravity of the situation. Her grief seemed genuine, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper secret. She subtly mentioned the old portrait, and Penelope's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition passing through them, before she quickly averted her gaze. It seemed Penelope knew more than she was letting on, and her silence might have been born not of fear for herself, but for someone else. The tight web of deceit was beginning to unravel, piece by careful piece. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The weight of evidence, particularly the will and diary, now hung heavy over Sir Geoffrey Ashworth. Inspector Craddock, under Miss Marple's quiet but persistent guidance, meticulously re-examined every aspect of the case. He found that Sir Geoffrey had indeed been making discreet inquiries about his wife's private fortune and the legalities of inheriting it. Craddock convened a small, tense gathering in the drawing-room of Blackwood Manor. Present were Sir Geoffrey, Penelope, Mr. Hemingway, Mrs. Gable, Inspector Davis, and, at Craddock's special request, Miss Marple. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and dread. Craddock began by laying out the evidence, the hidden will, the diary's accusations of poisoning, the financial desperation, and the unraveling alibi concerning the storm. Sir Geoffrey, though pale, continued to deny everything, portraying Lady Rowena's diary as the ramblings of a paranoid woman. "My wife was unwell, Inspector," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. Her mind was disturbed. "These are fantasies." It was then that Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire, spoke. Her voice, gentle and clear, cut through the tension. "It strikes me, Sir Geoffrey," she began, "that for a woman who was supposedly so disturbed, Lady Rowena showed a remarkable clarity of thought in preparing for her escape, or, as it were, her disappearance. The plain cloak, the lavender water, the new will, these are not the actions of a confused mind." She then turned her gaze to Penelope. "And you, my dear Penelope, must have been very close to your aunt. You saw her every day. Did you not notice her unease? Did she never speak to you of her fears?" Penelope, who had been twisting her hands in her lap, looked up, her face etched with torment. She did," Penelope whispered, her voice barely audible. "She told me she was afraid that Uncle Geoffrey was giving her things in her tea. She showed me the will. She wanted to run away." A sob caught in her throat. "But she was too frightened to go alone." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed. So if Lady Rowena disappeared and was planning to escape, why did she not take her will with her, or arrange for it to be delivered? Why leave it in a secret compartment, to be found after her disappearance?" "No," Miss Marple continued, her eyes fixed on Sir Geoffrey. "Lady Rowena did not disappear. She was made to disappear, and not just by one person." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "The key to this entire puzzle, Inspector, lies not in what was done, but in how it was done, and by whom the final, most crucial act was executed." Chapter 12. The Truth Unveiled. The silence that followed Miss Marple's statement was profound, broken only by the crackling fire. Sir Geoffrey's face was ashen, his composure finally shattered. Penelope stared at Miss Marple, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and nascent understanding. The priest hole was Lady Rowena's refuge, not her final resting place, Miss Marple explained calmly. She hid her preparations there, including the will, but she never intended for that to be the end. She fully intended to leave Blackwood Manor, to escape a husband she rightly feared. Miss Marple then detailed her final deductions. The tranquilizer, Sir Geoffrey, was intended to keep Lady Rowena compliant. You administered it subtly, hoping to portray her as mentally unstable, making her disappearance seem like a flight of fancy. Your financial desperation, as revealed by Mr. Ainsworth, provided a powerful motive. You intended to dispose of Lady Rowena and claim her fortune once the suitable mourning period had passed. She paused, then turned to Penelope. "However, Sir Geoffrey, you made one crucial mistake. You underestimated Lady Rowena's foresight, and you involved someone else in your scheme, someone whose conscience, I believe, could not bear the full weight of it alone. You had Mr. Hemingway assist you with the final disposal of Lady Rowena's body, perhaps using the old carriage to take her to a remote location. His gambling debts, as we now know, made him vulnerable to your coercion." At the mention of his name, Mr. Hemingway, who had been cowering in a corner, let out a choked cry and buried his face in his hands. "He threatened my family," he sobbed. "He said he'd ruin us all." Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "Lady Rowena's actual death likely occurred shortly after the storm, when the commotion could mask any sound. Her body was then removed from the house, but the true intent of the disappearance was not just to make her vanish, but to convince everyone she had gone willingly. And that, Inspector, is where Penelope enters the picture." Penelope gasped, shaking her head. "No, I didn't. I couldn't." "You did not kill your aunt, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes full of pity. "But you knew. You knew of your uncle's plan. And when your aunt vanished, you saw an opportunity, not for malice, but for justice. You knew of your aunt's fears, her preparations. You knew about the will she had hidden. You found the will, and instead of leaving it for the police to find immediately, you decided to wait to let Sir Geoffrey's false narrative unfold. You chose to let the letter arrive first, confirming a voluntary departure, buying time for your uncle to incriminate himself further, and for the hidden will to be discovered at a more opportune moment. Penelope finally broke down, tears streaming down her face. She told me where the will was, in case anything happened. I thought if it came out too soon, Uncle Geoffrey would deny everything or say she was mad. I wanted him to suffer for what he did to her. Miss Marple concluded, the motive ultimately was greed, Sir Geoffrey's insatiable greed. The moral lesson, perhaps, is that appearances, however grand, can hide the darkest truths, and that human nature, when pushed to its limits, can be capable of both great depravity and quiet, desperate acts of retribution. Lady Rowena's death was a murder disguised as a disappearance and orchestrated with cunning, but her foresight and Penelope's quiet defiance ensured the truth would eventually surface. Sir Geoffrey Ashworth was arrested shortly thereafter, and Mr. Hemingway implicated as an accessory. Lady Rowena's body was eventually discovered buried in a disused section of the estate, confirming the grim reality. Penelope, though facing charges for obstructing justice, was treated with leniency given her circumstances. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of Lady Rowena's disappearance and the unsettling truth behind it lingered like a ghost in the ancient elms. Miss Marple, once again, had seen through the veneer of gentility to the raw heart of human experience. If you've enjoyed our journey through mystery so far, do stay with Miss Marple until the